Good morning, everybody. Um, Thank you all for coming. This is really exciting to see everybody and to be here at SAFL. I'm Sarah Hobbie. I'm the lead principal investigator for the Minneapolis-St. Paul Metropolitan area long-term ecological research program. I probably left a word out there. And I'm going to start us off. I'm going to give a little overview presentation, and then I'm going to hand it over to the director of SAFL, Lian, who's going to tell you a little bit more about SAFL. So I will hold off and not try to fake my way through telling you about SAFL, but we're so excited to be able to hold this event here. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the LTER program, I thought it would be helpful to get a little background. This is a program that's been funded by the National Science Foundation since the late 70s, early 80s, when the NSF recognized that it was difficult to study ecological processes over the time frame of a regular NSF grant. And so they started this program where sites could compete to be funded on a 6-year cycle with the possibility for renewal. And so sites have come and gone in the network over the years because it's not automatic that you'll be renewed. But there are a number of sites now that have been in existence for 4 decades. And currently there are 27 sites funded by the LTER program. We're the newest site in the network. And these sites, as you can see, range from the Arctic to Antarctica. And there are basically right now 3 urban LTER sites in the network, 2 of which are currently receiving funding from NSF. So we're the MSP LTER, and the Central Arizona Phoenix LTER is also currently funded, and we have some folks from CAP LTER joining us today. We're really happy that they could be here. And then there's also ongoing research in the Baltimore site, and those sites were started in the mid-90s. So we're a new site to this network, but super excited to be able to, add to the urban sites in the network. So who we are, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about who we are. So we are research and educators. There are about 30 senior personnel on the project and a growing number of grad students, postdocs, undergraduates, and staff, and high school students. I believe we might have a high school student here too, right? And we come from mostly the University of Minnesota, but across a whole bunch of units, and sorry for all the acronyms, but basically most of the colleges and institutes at the university are represented. We also have folks from the Forest Service, from the University of St. Thomas, Nature Conservancy, and the Water Bar. And we represent a diversity of disciplines, both natural and physical sciences, as well as social sciences. And I think that it's safe to say that our site has more social scientists among the senior personnel than any other LTER site. So we're really thinking not about long-term ecological research, but really about long-term coupled social ecological research in our work. And then we couldn't do what we do without our partners, and a number of you are here today, and we just really appreciate all of the ways that we are able to partner with you in developing research questions, in obtaining data, in analyzing data, in accessing sites, in gaining all of your knowledge about urban nature, basically in the Twin Cities. So we're extraordinarily grateful for all the ways that you support what we do, and we're really excited that a number of you could come today. So our study site, people often ask me, like, where do you work? Where's your study site? Can I visit your study site? Our study site is basically the 7-county metro. And the reason that we focus at this scale is that a large component of what we're interested in relates to governance. And so the Twin Cities has really interesting governance, in that we have governance at the scale of the Met Council, but we also have governance at the scale of watershed districts and management organizations, counties, municipalities, et cetera. So when we first wrote the proposal, we had to justify why the Twin Cities was an appropriate region to have an urban LTER site. And some of the things that we recognized were that there are both challenges and opportunities here. Some of the challenges are that we have persistent environmental problems. We also have persistent social problems, so racial and socioeconomic disparities, including who benefits from urban nature. But there are also a number of opportunities. So one of them is the abundance of long-term data represented by many of you in this room. So a number of entities have been collecting environmental data for years and years. We also have this opportunity to do comparative work across lakes, across watersheds, across streams, but also across governance units, as I mentioned previously. And we're also a region in transition, both social and biophysical. And there's just been a richness of ongoing research, both at the university, at the Forest Service, and among all of many of the agencies that are represented in this room. So it was a good time to try to bring all of that research together under one umbrella. And there's a long history of connection between people and nature in the Twin Cities. There's a lot of value placed on nature in the urban area. So this is our sort of our overarching goal and our conceptual framework. So our goal is to try to understand relationships between urban nature and people, both to understand how urban ecosystems respond to rapid environmental and social change, as well as to inform approaches for addressing inequities and improving environmental outcomes for all residents. And so our conceptual model looks at interactions between people and nature in the cities across scales. So across scales, both within urban nature, from organisms to habitat patches to drainage networks to landscapes, as well as across the social system, from individuals to groups to municipalities to the whole metro region. And we're interested in how governance and policy and practice influence urban nature and including the benefits and burdens that people experience from urban nature, as well as what the feedbacks are from urban nature to the urban social system. And we organize our work around sort of several overarching questions. So we have a set of questions related to terrestrial ecosystems where we're interested in the interactive effects of urban stressors. So things like climate change, well, I have climate change kind of pulled out as a separate issue, but urban stressors like toxins, management, land use, and climate change and how those interact to influence urban ecosystems. We're also interested in a similar set of questions around aquatic ecosystems. And then on the social side, we're interested in how decision-making across scales influences environmental inequities, as well as how the process of conducting inclusive community-engaged research influences both scientific and community outcomes. And then we also have a number of education programs. So we partner with the Bell Museum in our Schoolyard LTER program. And then we also partner with a number of undergraduate programs, both at the University of Minnesota and at the University of St. Thomas. So this morning, what we're going to do is have a number of overview talks where we're going to be hearing about these different focal research questions. And we'll have a few talks, and then we'll have some time for break and networking. And then in the afternoon, we invite you to stay for lunch. And then we're going to kind of have a concurrent time where if you want to take a tour of SAFL, you can sign up for a tour. There will be 5 different tours. They're starting at staggered times. They are 30 minutes in length. They're limited to 15 minutes a person, and you should have closed-toed shoes to go on a tour. The signups are out at the registration desk. And then sort of concurrent with that, we'll have a poster session out in the hallway. So you can go on your tour and then come back and look at posters, or look at posters and then go on a tour. So it's pretty flexible. And then just for the MSP personnel, we're going to be making our way upriver to the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization for a visit there. So I wanted to just take a moment to reflect on where we are. So this is the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. This is a painting of the falls that as it appeared presumably back in the 1850s. This is also Owamniomini. So this place, the Dakota people call this place Owamniomini, and the Dakota believe that there are very powerful spirits that live in the falls. And I thought it would be helpful for us to reflect on where we are in the Twin Cities. So we are on the Dakota homelands, but also the present day home of Dakota people. And one thing that we've been doing in our work in the LTER is to challenge ourselves to think about what it means to be working in this place that is a Dakota place. And just downstream is Bedote, which is the origin place for Dakota people. There are places that are sacred to Dakota people all around us where we are. And so I think that as an LTER, we are trying to think about how do we use our position in the academy, our position of privilege, our position of power to elevate the voices and concerns of not just Dakota people, but other BIPOC people. So that's something that I want us to be continually thinking about as we do our work. And the other thing that I would like us to be thinking about today is you're going to be hearing, presentations about each of these research questions, but it's important for us to be thinking about how those connect with one another and to think about the linkages across them. So I hope that's something that we can all be keeping in mind over the course of the day. So just a few announcements. If you do not want your picture taken, tell me or Meredith Keller. And if you want to tweet, that would be awesome. I am not a Twitterer, but like other people I know are more savvy about this. Our Twitter handle is at MSP_LTER. The talks are 15 minutes. If people, and Shating is our wonderful timekeeper. And so if there's time, we'll have Q&A after each talk. But if people use up their time talking, then, let's make sure that we find each other during the breaks and use that time for Q&A. I want to remind you, this is a working laboratory, so pay attention, don't hit your head, don't trip, just be mindful of where you are. Hopefully you all found a place to park. If you have any questions about that, ask Ben, I guess. Don't ask me. We will be having lunch. It's going to be served out of room 305 after the talks. And then the poster session, as I said, starts at 1 p.m. And don't forget to, sign up and go on a tour if you're interested in doing that. So am I out of time? I have 1 minute. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take questions. Okay. All right. I'm super excited to be able to turn over the podium to Lian Shen, who's the director of the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. And he's just going to tell you a little bit about the lab.
Thank you. Welcome to the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. My name is Lian Shen, and I'm the director of the lab. So I have been in this position for more than 5 years. And I'm also a professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. Yeah. So I'm super excited to have the LTER folks here today. And it's such a wonderful thing to see this auditorium almost full of people, and to see there's such a very exciting program lining up for the day. So I wanted to give a brief introduction about the lab. So next page, please. Yeah. Well, I guess for this audience, I don't need to show this picture again, but this is something I used when I go around the world to introduce to people, okay, where SAFL is and what we do. So always I'll emphasize this blue line first. That's the Mississippi River. And could you hit on? Yeah. Then, okay, we have these wonderful cities, Twin Cities. Yeah, okay. And could you hit on that again? Okay. So, okay, now, okay, we zoom in to this waterfall, Anthony Falls. Okay. This waterfall is the only natural waterfall on the Mississippi River when we go upstream from all the way New Orleans to here. Yeah, and actually that's the reason why we had these twin cities. And then, okay, by this waterfall, okay, could you hit on that again? We have this Anthony Falls lab. Yeah. So the lab is by the Mississippi River, and actually, technically, we are on an island, Hennepin Island. And so this lab is built to utilize this 50 feet of water drop. Then okay, it diverts the river water from the reservoir upstream to let the water to go through this lab, to go through this building, to drive for all kinds of rooms, to do all kinds of water-related research. And the water volume actually is so large. At each second, we have 2,200 gallons of water, or that's equivalent to 300 cubic feet. Okay, or more than 8 cubic meters, depends on which units you want to use. Okay, but basically a large amount of water can go through this building, and we use the river water to study water. And after that, we let the water return to the river in a clean way. Okay. Next page. So this lab was commissioned in 1938. Okay. And it was built using the Works Progress Administration's funding to do that. And the grandfather of this lab is Dr. Lawrence Straub. So in the 1930s, he was sponsored by American Society of Civil Engineering, and to use that what is called the Freeman Fellowship. You probably have heard of that. Okay, so that sponsored him to go to Europe to visit a lot of labs in European countries, and so then he studied. Then he came back after 2 years of touring. Well, that's a wonderful job, right? Yeah. But he came back with great ideas. He was determined to build a world-class hydraulic lab. Yeah. So he joined University of Minnesota as a young associate professor in his 30s. Yeah. And then he designed this lab. He secured the funding from the Works Progress Administration. Okay. And then in less than 2 years, he, together with his students, designed this lab, and then he built this lab. Okay. So it was commissioned in 1938. And shortly after that, this lab became a center for hydraulics research in the world. Yeah. And then as time progressed, the lab changes nature from hydraulic lab into a lab focusing more and more on environmental fluid flows. Next page. Yeah. So the lab today is a multiple disciplinary fluid mechanics research and education facility center of the university. It is under the College of Science and Engineering. In this lab, we have a lot of people, including 18 faculty from 5 different departments. So the idea is for people studying fluid flows in a natural environment from different backgrounds, and those 5 departments, well, it could be civil environmental geoengineering, it could be earth science, environmental engineering, it could be mechanical engineering, and I'm from mechanical engineering, and it also can be from aerospace engineering and mechanics. And also we have Professor Jacques Finley from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, Behavior. Yeah, okay. So, well, biologic, yeah. And so we have people from different backgrounds. And also one unique feature is the lab has 42 staff members. They include research associates, they include technicians, engineers, a lot of them, and also supporting staff and administrative staff. Yeah, and also we host a large number of students, from all the way from undergraduate to graduate, from visiting students, so on and so forth, okay, to conduct research. Yeah, so could you get that? Yeah. So in short, okay, in this building, we have a lot of nerds who are passionate about studying environmental geophysical fluid flows. and I'm proud to be one of the nerds. Okay. And this lab now, okay, is very new, very modern. And keep in mind that this building is 85 years old. Yeah, okay. And then okay, in 2012, the lab used about 2 years, utilized $8 million from NSF, and with another $8 million from state and university. So altogether, with $16 million, have a very comprehensive renovation of this building. And in that renovation, I heard there were two things that were untouchable. Okay, one is this exterior of this building, because it's already part of the history of the city. Okay, so therefore, okay, nobody wants to touch that. Okay, and the second thing that was not touchable are the seats you are sitting on now. Yeah, okay. And this you probably recognize, those are very okay, old-fashioned and multi-theaters, and so those were from those older days, and people liked them so much, so therefore nobody want to touch that. Yeah, okay. And the next page. Okay. So the focus of the lab nowadays, it has been focusing on fundamental fluid flows. And fluid flows, we're talking about water flows, air flows, and basically, okay, anything in this fluid phase, then we studied. And we focus a lot on the environment, so that can be, atmosphere, in the air, okay, and water, groundwater, okay, okay. And then, okay, also, okay, we study a lot about energy, and particularly for renewable energy. Yeah. Okay. Next page. So, okay, what does this lab offer? Well, we have, of course, wonderful people. Okay, yeah. And also, this is a huge building. So, okay, it has 5 floors. Okay, so when you came from street side, it looks like this is just one level, like low-rise building. Okay, but from the river side, actually now already you are on the 3rd floor, and then above that there's a top floor. That is the entire top floor is a huge wind tunnel. Okay, and then go 2nd floor, 1st floor, and the basement. Okay, so in the afternoon, you are going to see that by your own eyes. Okay, yeah. So I won't talk too much about this. Okay, so basically, okay, when you go to those different floors, you will realize immediately what I meant. There are so many rooms and wind tunnels and so on and so forth. Yeah. And I want to get a chance to show you, okay, there are some also off-site sites. For example, okay, we are the probably only university has a wind turbine that big. Okay, so this is 2.5 megawatts of wind turbines. Yeah, and so that is located southeast part of the city and in Rosemont, and 2.5 megawatts means this hub height is 80 meters tall, and these blades are 96 meters in diameter. Yeah, okay. And so 80-meter tall means what? Means, well, actually, when I first became the director, then one thing I did is to climb up that. Okay, yeah. So it took me a couple of hours to do, yeah. And it does have an elevator, yeah, but okay, I choose to do it physically. Yeah. Okay. Next page. And also nowadays, okay, we also use computer simulations to study a lot of those flows. And here are some examples of the computer simulations. Next, yeah. And so we study, okay, well, waves in water and in lakes and ocean and the wind, okay, and we want to simulate these fluid flows accurately. So we call the code we developed to simulate this with this long name. And there's a reason for this long name. Could you hit one more time? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So this is the code, the computational tools developed in-house has this name. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, with that, okay, I will stop here. Okay. So welcome to SAFL. Okay. And I'm really, really glad to see, okay, LTER, okay, the activities here. Okay. And so enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Lian. So our next speaker is Emilie Snell-Rood. Emilie comes to us from the University of Minnesota and the Department of Ecology, Evolution, Behavior. And she's going to be talking about work that the LTER is doing on toxins.
Great, thank you. Okay, So good morning. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll just start by saying none of the data in this talk is published. So I'm happy if you want to tweet things, but please don't tweet the actual data because some of the analyses are preliminary, like I did them yesterday. So we're still actively working on this. All right. So I'm going to be giving an overview of sort of bits and pieces of the toxins sub-aim of the LTER. And this work is really a community of scientists, of faculty, of students, graduate students, postdocs, high school students. This is just a sampling of some of the people involved. I'll try to highlight some of these folks as we go through the data, but really this is a huge effort. And so I want to thank and acknowledge all of those people and also the community partners that we're working with on this work. So in sort of the broad umbrella questions that we're interested in is the ecology and also a little bit of what I'm calling the evolutionary biology of urban contaminants. And so these are questions that are interesting both from sort of a basic biology perspective, but also that have immediate applications to thinking about human well-being. And here, contaminants we're defining broadly. This can be anything from pesticides to road salt to macronutrients like nitrogen, fertilizers, metals, and microplastics. And thinking about how these contaminants move through urban ecosystems is really important for human health and also the health of those ecosystems themselves. And if you want to answer questions about how contaminants are moving through ecosystems, and this is a diagram here of the lead cycle, you really have to understand the human element. And this is one reason why I think thinking about urban contaminants through the lens of this LTER is really exciting from a scientific perspective, because we are thinking about the social layer, the social dimension of cities. That's a huge part of thinking about how these elements or these toxins or these chemicals are moving through ecosystems. So what I want to do today is just give you a sampling of some of what we're doing. And what we're doing falls into three overall questions. How are these toxins or contaminants distributed? Why do species vary in their exposure to these toxins? And then also their tolerance to these toxins. And then what can we do about it? And all of these questions are presented separately here, but we try to integrate them as much as possible so that when we collect data, we're kind of contributing to all of these questions. And we're working on a number of contaminants, but today I'm mostly going to show you data with respect to heavy metals because that's where we have most of the data so far. But we're doing many similar things with other contaminants, including salts and microplastics. So I'm going to start here with how are toxins distributed. And this is work really led by Nick Jelensky, who's in the soil sciences department, but many of us, including Kara Santelli, who's here, and others are contributing to the efforts to build sort of a big database of soil heavy metals. And Nick has really been working on this for several decades, amassing past metal data and adding new metal data across the Twin Cities. And we're interested in it from sort of a biology question, but also with respect to humans, because lead is a neurotoxin, a developmental toxin in humans. The CDC says no lead level is safe for human development. And despite lead declining in abundance over the decades, there are still parts of the Twin Cities that have elevated lead levels. These are census districts here. The darker blue show census districts with relatively higher childhood blood lead levels. And we've been particularly interested in these two census districts here in East St. Paul, which have the highest blood lead levels in the state. And so while we're interested in describing patterns of metals in the cities, we also want to collect data that's relevant to thinking about the human dimension, and in particular trying to think about, well, why are they so high here? And some of our partners have been wondering that as well. So we've been amassing data, both past and recent data, adding data from new sites. We have been trying to choose sites to sample where the data generated has immediate relevance to people. So this is sometimes people's yards, sometimes people's spaces where people are doing urban agriculture, areas that are sacred to groups and might be using medicinal plants from those areas. And in this work, we've been amassing this data and then working with Mary, who's the data guru on this work, to map this. And I'm just going to show you some preliminary maps from St. Paul, where we have the best resolution so far. But this is the kind of thing we're doing, is trying to build these maps for the whole Twin Cities. So here's St. Paul, and just for reference, here are the different neighborhoods, which you can kind of see overlaid here. So this is the map for lead, and some of the things map onto the childhood blood lead data. But some of them, so for instance, here's East St. Paul over here, higher levels in the soil, but that's not necessarily the highest. There's actually high along Summit and Rondo neighborhood and around Como as well. But the other thing that we can do that's interesting is expand beyond lead, where there's been a lot of work done into other metals. So here's zinc. It shows sort of a rough spatial correlation with lead. And here's copper, which is sort of correlated, but not as much, and also really patchy. So we're expanding out to look at about a dozen metals, and we can look at sort of spatial covariation between these metals. We're also thinking about not just soil, but deposition from the air. And so here we've been working with Natalia Cook and Daniel Stanton to use lichens as air pollution monitors. We transplant them from an unpolluted site, put them out. They could get pretty much everything they need from the air, so they really bioaccumulate metals, and then we collect them 3 to 6 months later. And I just plotted this yesterday. So the pilot data that we collected last year was mostly from St. Paul. We were interested in East St. Paul and testing the hypothesis that maybe if it's not just soil, could it also be the downtown airport? Because gasoline in small jet engines is still leaded. And indeed, these data support this idea. This summer, Natalia just got LCCMR funding to expand this out to a lot more sites to collect more data. But this is kind of suggestive that we do need to worry about that airport. And here's an example where thinking about policy changes, it could change this spatial pattern of metal accumulation. So we're generating this descriptive data to think about spatial variation in metals and in thinking about metals and soil and air. And we're also working on water. We can think about how this then moves through the food chain to affect wildlife in the city. And also humans. So the next question I want to highlight is, given that, we describe how these metals are distributed, some species are there. There is pollution there, but people are there, wildlife is there. Some of them are tolerating these pollutants. Which ones are they, and why are they tolerating it? So we're testing a number of hypotheses here, especially using pollinators as a study system. And I'm just going to give you one example with butterflies. And here we're testing the hypothesis that, well, maybe if you have an evolutionary history with really nasty plant defensive chemicals, you're sort of pre-adapted, you can deal well with these novel human toxins. So there are butterflies and moths and insects in general that feed on plants that produce defensive chemicals that also happen to be mutagenic. And that can damage DNA and can cause free radicals. And the reason why this is interesting with respect to heavy metals is that heavy metals can also do the same thing. So heavy metals can, and these plant mutagens can cause DNA damage, can cause the production of oxidative stress and free radicals. And so if there's this common underlying mechanism, and so we wanted to test this idea. And so we did this by looking across a whole bunch of butterflies. This is just a sampling of butterflies that happen to be common in the Twin Cities. And we were interested in the idea that we collected them along a gradient of metal exposure, looked at the levels of metals in their bodies in the adults as a measure of their exposure as caterpillars, and then took some measures of condition. So this guy would be more tolerant as metals go up in their body. They're still big. And this guy would be more sensitive. They start to decline in body size. So this is work led by Lindsay and also Ashley in the lab. And last summer, they went out and collected about 800 butterflies across a whole bunch of sites spread along this gradient of, this is the childhood blood lead levels, to get a sort of a proxy for metal exposure. And the first thing I'll show you is that butterflies and humans seem to have similar environmental determinants of body lead content. So this is the human blood lead levels, average, moderate, and high. And then these are butterflies that were collected in those same areas. The butterflies collected in the moderate and high lead levels for humans also have high body lead content. So it suggests similar environmental determinants, whether from the soil or the air. We see the exact same pattern in a separate study in bees. We also see variation across species and sensitivity to lead. This is a lots of little charts just showing all the species that we had. But just to illustrate what this is, here are two related species as an example. This guy, as body lead levels go up, is not really phased, sort of the same wing size across this lead levels. Whereas this sulfur species, as body lead exposure levels go up, body size decreases. So we would say this guy is more sensitive, and this one is more tolerant. If you compare the axis here, these are getting, on average, have higher, are surviving with higher body lead contents than this one. So how does this then relate to what types of plants they feed on and the mutagenicity of those plants? And I'm not going to talk to you about how we measured that, but I'm happy to talk to you about that afterwards if you want. But we really see mixed support for this idea. We had two measures of tolerance. The first one is the slope of this line. So more negative values are more sensitive, and there's nothing going on here. So each point is a species, but there's a flat line. Species that are feeding on more mutagenic host plants are not necessarily more tolerant to lead. We do see mixed support, a little bit of support, but not significant for the overall lead tissues that lead levels that they're tolerating in their body. Thank you. But it's really just driven by a handful of species up here that have really high host plant mutagenicity and also really high blood lead levels, thorax lead levels. So we're currently looking at other metals. We've just analyzed lead so far, also thinking about other things like niche breadth or something else. But one thing that I think is interesting with respect to lead is that, maybe lead levels today are actually pretty low relative to the selective history of these butterflies, because humans, fortunately, have put a lot of policies into place to reduce lead levels. This just shows human blood lead levels over time have decreased as we've implemented policies to ban lead in paint and gasoline, et cetera. And we've been working with the mammal collection as part of the Bell Museum's natural history collection to look at this in animals. And you see this exact same pattern in mammals. So this is the lead levels in the fur and hair of these three species of mammals all around the Twin Cities and Minnesota. And you see a marked decrease over time. But interestingly, a lot of this legislation is happening in the 70s. It starts before then. So we also have to layer on this temporal aspect, and animals are presumably adapting to this as well, which makes it even more complicated. So the last thing I'll touch on is what can we do about it? We're working on a number of things here. First, we're thinking about research. We're doing research on specific interventions. Some work we're just starting this summer and next fall is looking at lead in stormwater ponds. And then this group led by Lee Penn is looking at, these are little cellulose, iron oxide coated cellulose fibers that are absorbing lead in water and testing those in water systems. We have also received funding in sites where we find relatively higher lead levels in urban agriculture areas to help them mitigate that exposure. So here, one of the sites that we surveyed last year that had slightly elevated lead levels, we used this grant funding to help them put in all of these raised beds. And then finally, we're expanding collaborations with Urban Roots, a nonprofit in East St. Paul that has an internship program to actually trial certain interventions in some of their garden plots especially related to expanding work in microplastics. So I'll end there and just say I highlighted sort of a sampling of work in metals, which we're continuing with along with other contaminants. We're also starting this summer expanding quite a bit more into thinking about microplastics in urban environments and their distribution and mitigation there. So I'll stop there and I might have a question. Time for a couple questions. Thanks. No, we can go. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Holly.
I'm wondering if the rare ones may have already.
Yeah, so that's a great question. This kind of makes it hard with this. Like, how do you sample the butterflies that are really sensitive? Because they're not even going to be there, and they're not going to be there. You would need to bring them into the lab and rear them. But a lot of the rare ones are the hardest ones to rear. So for a lot of this, we're kind of just assuming that this would apply to the rare ones. Although if people have ideas on how we can deal with that, yeah. There are some that were sort of moderately common that we got okay sampling last summer, and we're hoping to get enough sampling as of this year. But like cabbage whites, I think we collected 200. And they're those and painted ladies and seem to be really tolerant. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Emilie. And if you do have a question, we should try to get the mic. We have a mic that we can, okay. We'll use the mic for questions because the online audience, there are a few folks. So our next speaker is Leslie Brandt, who is from the U.S. Forest Service, and she is going to talk to us about work in urban forests.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm with the U.S. Forest Service Office of Sustainability and Climate, and sometimes they let me pretend to do research. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that we're doing on the resilience of urban forests. So three different projects. The first looking at the biodiversity and vulnerability of street trees, and that's with Adrian back there. And then the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project at Crosby Farm Regional Park. And then the Urban Forest Patch Structure Diversity and Resilience project that Vinny is leading, and he and Sally have posters on that this afternoon. So I'll talk more about these first two and touch a little bit on the last one as well. So the first one, we're interested in kind of understanding the biodiversity of the tree canopy in the Twin Cities. So we have a lot of assumptions about that, but we wanted to test those assumptions by looking at what the composition is of the street tree canopy in the Twin Cities, and what factors influence biodiversity, and how does street tree biodiversity relate to vulnerability to climate change, and looking at both the vulnerability of the trees themselves and also the relationships with human communities that depend on those trees. So to look at this question, we assembled a data set of municipal and county and park and NGO and academic inventories, and pulled all of those together into one large data set, and then did some filtering to look at specifically those trees that were identified to species and that had a large enough sample size and had data on their climate vulnerability from a previous study. So we had about 513,000 species individual trees that we looked at. So what did we find? We found that predominantly, as you might expect, maple species were the most dominant genus in the urban tree canopy. And this is looking specifically at street trees, so those along the streets, and not looking at private lands. And then ash was the second most dominant. Now, some of these inventories are several years old, and so that number is probably a lot lower now. And these ash trees are being replaced with a more diverse suite of species, so that if we did this study again, we would probably see a shift in some of those numbers. So then we wanted to look at how is biodiversity distributed across the 7-county metro area. And what we found is that species richness was very high in the urban core. So census tracts within Minneapolis, especially along the Minnehaha Creek and those lakes there, had some of the highest biodiversity, both by looking at total species richness and also looking at Shannon's diversity index. So then we also wanted to look at vulnerability of different tree species. And so here we are looking at, and that overlay with social vulnerability. So those areas in dark orange are areas that the CDC has identified as having higher social vulnerability. So those are those dark orange areas. And then those areas that are outlined in like kind of that darker are areas where we have high vulnerability of our street trees as well. And so there's not necessarily a strong correlation, but by overlaying these two different pieces of data, we are able to look at areas that might be socially vulnerable as well as have high ecological vulnerability. And those might be areas that we might want to target some of our climate adaptation efforts in the future. So the second project that I'm going to talk about is the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project. And several of you were able to visit this site when we toured it a couple of years ago. And here we're looking at a few questions about, first, are locally native species better adapted to current and future climates than species from further south that might be adapted to warmer climates? How far, if we did what we call assisted migration and move species, how far south can we source those trees? And then can we use silvicultural practices that are used in rural forest management in urban areas to inform natural areas management? Traditional silviculture and forestry has typically not been applied to urban natural areas. And so this is something that we in the Forest Service are really interested in thinking about, taking some of these practices and modifying them for urban areas. So this is a collaborative effort. There are a lot of people listed. Some of these folks are in the room. A big partner here is Mississippi Park Connection, along with the City of St. Paul Parks Department and the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. We've been working together for several years on this project, even before the LTER was funded, and it was originally funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund. And then we've been continuing to get funding more recently from the LCCMR. This project is part of a network of sites called the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network. There are sites all over the United States, as well as a few in Canada. We have 2 sites in Minnesota. The first site that was established is up at the Chippewa National Forest and the Cutfoot Experimental Forest that has been ongoing for almost a decade now. But we are the first urban site, and so that's very exciting. And we are also the only site that is in a floodplain. So that makes it additionally challenging. We are testing a spectrum of different climate adaptation options at this site. We are looking at trying to improve resistance to climate change by maintaining a relatively unchanged conditions. So that is one treatment in this replicated design. The second treatment is what we call resilience treatment, where we're accommodating some degree of change, but returning to prior reference conditions following a disturbance. And then the third is where we're kind of trying to align with future conditions using models to project future habitat suitability for trees. So we have a number of different hypotheses about this project. First, that resistance treatment will be initially the most adapted to the site, but that over time, this is a very long-term, multi-decade project, but we'll see a decline in survival as things change with our climate. In the transition treatment, we expect lower growth and survival at first, but that over time, these are going to be those treatments that are more aligned with future conditions. And then that resilience treatment might kind of be the in-between, where it has more moderate growth and survival over the long term. So we planted trees in 2020, which was also challenging in a floodplain when everyone was wearing masks and socially distancing. And what we found after 3 years is it's kind of in line with what we had expected. So our resistance treatment generally had the highest survival, and especially in the first year. And the resilience treatment has had very high survival. And then that transition treatment in yellow what we've actually seen is an increase in survival. And that's because we have what we are calling our zombie trees, where they didn't leaf out in the first year. And so, we also have a whole bunch of other data that we're analyzing, and a student is just finishing up some of that analysis. Another cool thing is this collaborative effort with Willard Mailbear and the Wakantipi Awanyan Kapi. I'm sorry, I'm still learning. We developed these signs that were placed out at the site last summer that talk about the cultural significance of the different tree species in those different treatments. And so these plots are set up along a pathway that people can bike and walk down, and then they can go and see the plots and learn about the project. And so we're really excited about that collaboration. And then the third project I'll touch on is this urban forest patch structure diversity and resilience project. So this is looking at urban forest patches, so those little natural areas within the matrix of the urban area. And so not looking at street trees like the first study, but really looking at those natural areas that have at least a 30-meter radius of continuous tree canopy cover. And the idea here is thinking about, as forest biodiversity and structural complexity increase, it increases the resilience of that system to disturbances, including climate change, pest and disease, and invasive species. So the goal is to use remote sensing, observation, and field assessments to evaluate structure and diversity across the Twin Cities metro, to understand how forest resilience is distributed on these on this urban system, and how to guide forest management and conservation efforts. So this is a little bit cut off, I'm sorry, but so we're using field assessments coupled with JEDI, LiDAR data, and Sentinel-2 time series observations to assemble these machine learning models and predict forest structure and diversity across the area. So these graphs, and ask Vinny about them, because this is not my project, but what we're seeing is that there is pretty good agreement between the remote sensing data and the on-the-ground observational data. So that's really great. And then we're using these models to predict forest metrics and biodiversity and structure for points across the Twin Cities metro area. And if you're interested in learning more and talking with somebody who has more expertise than myself in this project, you can find Vinny and Sally during the poster session. And just some ideas for collaboration, thinking about where we could go with some of these projects. Eric Lonsdorf was presenting just a few weeks ago about the ecosystem services tree canopy study, and I think that there could be some really great opportunities for collaboration there. I think that because we're working in a floodplain down at Crosby, it would be really cool to add some more hydrological research. And then we're really also interested in, because this is at near the Bidote site, thinking about cultural significance and cultural collaborations at that site as well. Would love to think more about how we can link pollinators and wildlife to these studies of urban tree biodiversity. And then finally, trying to tease apart more about what's kind of driving decisions about tree planting and species selection, and how social factors and governance can influence those. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Susanna. Yeah.
I don't have to know.
So I have a question about the biodiversity slide that you showed, and what I thought was really interesting that it was higher biodiversity of the trees in the urban area compared to further out. And so from a wildlife perspective, we see these opposite patterns where you have lower biodiversity in the urban core, and as you move further out, higher biodiversity. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what you think might be happening.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of things that are happening. So first of all, street trees themselves are just more of a thing in more densely urban areas. And so as you move out to the exurbs, there are just fewer street trees planted. And so more of the tree canopy is in these natural patches, like what Vinny's study is looking at. And so we were not looking at those natural areas. And so the structural and the total tree canopy and having that core forest and that structural complexity, I think really influences what wildlife biodiversity can be supported. And then also looking at what species are planted in street tree along streets. A lot of those are non-native species. And so there's a mismatch between the services that a wildlife species would require and the services that we're getting from the biodiversity of the urban tree canopy. And I think that the urban tree canopy diversity is still important and in incorporating non-native species, because if we only planted natives in the urban core, we could be putting ourselves at risk like we were with emerald ash borer, because there's just not that many species that can tolerate those harsh urban environments. So good question. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it. I was just wondering if throughout your research, you observed a relationship between racially concentrated areas of poverty and low-income neighborhoods and the type of trees selected? And if not, could you?
I will defer to Adrienne on that, and somebody could follow up with her maybe at the break. But yeah, so those areas that had like higher social vulnerability tend to be those areas that are lower income and minority dominated. And so I would have to look more in depth on what species there are, but I don't think we saw like a high correlation.
I think a lot of times it's because, for example, thank you. For example, in Minneapolis, the city is primarily dictating what trees are planted. And so that's at the large municipality level rather than at the neighborhood level. There is some like individual neighborhood planting, but that tends to be a small percentage of the total, especially street trees that are being planted. So we didn't see that strong relationship that we might have thought.
And I think one of the things we did find was that older neighborhoods tended to have higher street tree biodiversity than younger neighborhoods. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Leslie. So we built in a couple breaks this morning because we don't want y'all just sitting around listening and zoning out, but we want people to actually have a chance to talk to each other. So we're going to have a break. There's more coffee, etc., just down the hall, and we'll start promptly at 10:15. I do have 2 requests though before you take off. If you didn't actually sign in, please sign in. That the university just needs a list of who was here, and then they'll reimburse us, etc. And if you do want to take a tour of SAFL and you didn't get an opportunity to sign up, make sure you sign up. There are 5 different sign up sheets because each of the tours is limited to 15 people. So those are back at the registration table. But otherwise, yeah, go ahead and enjoy the break, and we'll be back at 10:15. All right. So our next speaker is Susanna Lerman, who's also from the U.S. Forest Service, and she's going to be talking about work on pollinators.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So welcome, everybody. So on behalf of the BLON team, it's nice we have a nice acronym. My co-lead, Adam Kay, Eric Lonsdorf, Kristen Nelson, Ryan Schwab, and Eric Watkins. So I wonder, who here likes strawberries? Yeah. Who here likes the shade of trees, especially when it's really hot out? Yeah. Well, then we need to thank bees, right? So more than 87% of all flowering plants are pollinated by bees. And they perform a $56 billion service by pollinating our crops every year within the United States. But bees are in trouble. They need us. And one of the reasons is loss of habitat. Specifically, we're seeing the conversion of like native prairies and forests into intensive agriculture and residential development. This issue of the bees being in trouble really hit home for me on this date, February 10th, 2017. Does anybody know the significance of that date? Yes, they were listed as endangered species in the Endangered Species Act, the first bee species to get listed. So again, it's not really something that you want to be known for as being the first, but there we have it. So the rusty patched bumblebee, and here we have the range of this species. And what I want to point out is that there's this really hot spot area of the rusty patched bumblebee in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, particularly in backyards. So the talk here, I'm talking about bees and lawns, and you might think, well, what do lawns have to do with this? And it was funny when I was thinking about this presentation, this song came into my head, and later that day, I saw the news, so I just wanted to give a shout out to Tina. But why do we care about lawns? So a couple of years ago, somebody had measured them, and it's roughly 163,800 square kilometers of lawn in the United States. What does that actually mean? So I'm from New England, I'm from Massachusetts. It's the equivalent of the state of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So it's a lot of lawn. And what do we do to these lawns? We irrigate them, we fertilize them, we mow them, and they look like these lovely golf courses. And so a lot of my colleagues, my wildlife ecologist colleagues, really think about these as these biological deserts and really useless for birds, for bees, and other types of wildlife. And they're really trying to figure out, how do we get rid of lawns? But 163,800 square kilometers is a lot of lawn to try to get rid of. So I've been thinking about this question for a while now, and have come up with this new mantra, like, how do we make our lawns less bad? And I think that's from a wildlife biology, a wildlife habitat perspective, I think that we can say that throughout these urban environments. Like, we're never going to make them these pristine habitat areas, but we can make them less bad. And so as part of our project here with the Minneapolis-St. Paul LTER, we've been working with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, Bowser, on their program to introduce these lawns to legumes, also known as bee lawns, to try to get at this question of making our lawns less bad. And for here, it's really trying to reseed the lawns with different types of flowers, like clover, and there's some creeping Charlie and a few other species that Eric and Ryan can let me know what they are. But the idea here is that in addition to having our lawns, we can also have some bee food growing within these, both specifically planted and also some of these spontaneous species. And so a big part of our research question is really getting at, do these bee lawns work, and also for who? Because as a continual theme throughout a lot of the different projects within the MSP LTER is really integrating people into the research as well. And so we have a number of different project objectives that are getting at some really key ecological questions, specifically urban ecology research questions, but also some of these social factors as well, so that we can find out whether or not these lawns work for bees and who is experiencing some of these ecosystem services of these bees. And finally, we've really tried to work closely with our partners, both with Bowser and also the Fish and Wildlife Service, to make sure that the science that we're developing and creating is going to be very useful to help them inform some of these management practices. And so that's also a really key component to the research project that we're doing. So what do we know about the lawns, or sorry, about the yards in the metro area? And so this is some of the work with Megan Classic and Kristen Nelson, part of their team with the advocacy, policy, and practice. And Megan will go into a lot more deeper dives of some of their data of this household survey, asking a whole bunch of questions about people's interactions with their yards. And one of the things I just want to point out in terms of the figure on the left, in terms of how much of your yard is covered by grass, the take-home message is a lot. And so the other question we wanted to know is, like, how do people feel about bees? Do people like bees? And so one of the questions on this household survey asks this question about concerns. And what I want to point out here, I'm not going to read these, but what I've done is I've highlighted, there's the top two in yellow are concerns about the conservation of bees and about their loss of habitat. But the bottom three are about people's fears and about these negative interactions and how people are viewing bees. And so when we think about creating bee habitat in people's private spaces, we need to make sure that we're taking both of these different aspects into consideration. So in terms of what we're finding out about bees and lawns across the Twin City area, we've been working in, it originally was 80 yards, now it's 79. We're trying to increase, so I think we have one more yard that we've added. But looking along these income and bee habitat gradients across the region, and here's an example of some of the different types of yards. And one of the things that we really wanted to make sure is that we were capturing all the variation of the different types of lawns. So we have this one, and when Adam went and recruited this yard, and he sent me a text of this picture, and he's like, oh, they're joining our project. And I thought he was joking, but no, they really are, and they've got probably like 2 weeks. This is one of the larger lawns that we're working on, but we also have some of these yards that are these official bee lawns. And then some of these other yards that are somewhat do-it-yourself kind of lawns that are good for bees. But we really want to make sure, like, to see how bees are responding to these different types of ways that people are managing their lawns. And so first we want to really see, well, what's going on with the different types of plants. And so this is the part of the project that Eric Watkins and Ryan Schwaber are leading, looking at the different types of plants using these 1 meter square quadrats in these lawns, and then identifying every single plant that's within these quadrats. And I have two bar charts here on the left in terms of which species are the most widespread and which are most abundant. And I put little icons of flowers because the take-home message here is that, not surprisingly, within the lawns, it's mostly grasses, but there are some flowers that are growing within these lawns. And again, seeing that it's mostly white clover is the most abundant, and then dandelions are growing in there as well as wood sorrel. And then here are some of the most abundant and most common of the lawn flowers. And I want to point out that for a lot of these yards, these are just spontaneous species. These are plants that they're part of the seed bed that are just growing in. But they're also part of these official bee lawn types of seed mixes. So it's a mix of them. But one of the other things to notice is that these are pretty small flowers. They're, again, probably about that size, maybe a little bit bigger than a quarter, around that size. But they really can provide some opportunities and some food resources for bees. At least we hope so. But okay, been talking a lot about lawns, but what about bees? And so we had our first pilot season last year, again, looking at 79 yards. We documented 58 different individual bees. Of 6 different species. But one of the things I want to point out is that of the 79 yards, only 12 of them had bees in them. And so we're still trying to figure out what was going on. But as a pilot season, we're still trying to figure out what are some of the ways that we can improve this study so that we can actually identify more bees, so that we can get a stronger implications in terms of how bees are responding to the different types of plants that are growing within the lawns. But I just want to spend some time just to for you all to fall in love with what I think is kind of the megafauna of the insect world, the bumblebees, because they're super cute. And then just to get a sense of which species are the most abundant and most widespread across these different yards within the Twin Cities. One thing I want to mention is that, first of all, we didn't document any rusty-patched bumblebees, which good, bad, we don't know. But the other thing is that we did all catch and release, so no bumblebees were killed in the course of our study. And so we've been working very closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service in terms of getting permission to go out and handle these bees. But again, I just think they're super cute. In terms of, we also identified what the bees were on when we were capturing them. And so not surprising, most of the bees were on white clover. And here's, a few of the other different species. And what's really exciting, again, a lot of these lawns were not official bee lawns, but a lot of these flowers are part of the bee lawn mix. So again, this is giving us some indication that if we have more of these bee lawns and if we plant some of these bee lawn mixes, we have a good opportunity of providing habitat for bees. So this was one of the sites that we visited. And I just want to ask, how many bees do you think we captured on this yard? 2? 3? Dan says 3? 0? 28. So this is interesting. This is a photograph that I got from Zillow. Which is kind of cool. And it just shows, but when we went there last year, the lawn was covered in clover, which maybe could have been a nice selling point, but maybe not. But again, what I think, what I think is really interesting is that you never know what's out there. But the other picture that I noticed on Zillow is it shows the backyard. And it shows this beautiful pollinator garden in the back. And so that might be a reason why we're seeing so many different species of bees, or so many individuals in different species, 5 of the 6 in this lawn. And so this got us thinking, because what we did last year was just focused on sampling bees on the lawn. And so this way we're trying to figure out what is the added value of these bee lawns, and being able this year to be looking at both the lawns and also the ornamental flowers that are growing as well, recognizing that we're only at these yards for about 15 minutes sampling them, and bees fly. And so we want to make sure that we're actually documenting what species might be there. Some additional components of our study that we're going to be looking at is things like pollination rates. So putting out potted plants of echinacea, and again, seeing how these different plants are pollinated, and whether or not having a bee lawn or different types of flowers is going to increase pollination rates. And then also setting up these bee hotels to look at nest success, fecundity. So these are a couple of aspects that we're adding this summer. And then this fall, we're going to be going out and doing an experiment to really get at what I find very exciting, and again, in terms of urban ecology research, is how big and how many of these bee lawns do we have to have in order to start seeing some of these population effects. And so with that, what I'm hoping that we're able to do in our research is reimagining our lawns. And there's been a number of different programs recently about people just changing the narrative of how we're managing these systems, whether it's being a lazy lawnmower, these bee lawns, the slow-mo summer, and the no-mow May are just a few to mention. But hopefully what we'll see in the future, and hopefully we'll be able to document this, is changes that we're going to see across the Twin Cities. And so with that, if there's time for a question or two, or not, one question or later? One question.
Thanks. Great talk, Susanna. I was curious, do you see any relationship between honeybee prevalence and bumblebee abundance? Do they compete? And does beehives affect your data here?
So that's a great question. And we've been talking to people about that very issue. So we're just focusing on bumblebees. So we're not capturing honeybees. When we were out the other day, though, the only bees I saw were honeybees. So it would be a good question to address at some point.
Thank you, Susanna. So we're going to kind of move into the aquatic realm for a couple of talks, more specifically. And so our first talk is about the watershed work that we're doing, and the LTER, and Shuifeng is going to give this presentation.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'm Shuifeng. I am a faculty in the Department of Civil environmental and geoengineering at the University of Minnesota. And today, what I'm going to be speaking on is going to be a lot of work contributed by many people. So I'm only speaking on behalf of the watershed group, which consists of, well, Diana Carlin, who is also in the audience from the Department of Forest Resources, Lucy Rose, Jeannie, who will be presenting a poster later this afternoon, Ray and Faith, who just defended her master thesis last week, Shating, who's doing the timekeeping, and then Indigo, our undergrad student who has helped us a lot with developing some of the sensors that we've constructed to put on the trees that you can see from a picture from last week when Aiden, our new REU student, who I think is also here, helped us to set up these instruments, which you'll see in some of the later pictures. And so we're all trained as hydrologists, and so we're interested in where water goes, how much water, where they're going in the urban environment. And we're all excited to approach this question because coming from kind of a classical hydrological science, there's actually a lot of modifications that we had to make in our methodological approach and some of the questions that we ask, because in urban environments, the watersheds are much patchier, subject to lots more landscape heterogeneity, as well as management impacts. And so the overarching question that we're interested in our group is, how do we incorporate these units of urban nature like trees and green infrastructure like rain gardens into the management of stormwater and climate adaptations. We're interested in linking these trees and green infrastructure functionally, so not just looking at where they are, how much they are, but like what do they look like, what are they doing, how much water they're taking up into these hydrological outcomes. And so I'll be speaking specifically in terms of these management of stormwater and climate adaptation in terms of their ability to regulate ambient temperature and cool their environments. And so this talk, there's going to be two parts. I'm going to first talk about some of the site level work we're doing, looking at local trade-offs and the benefits and burdens of these urban nature, and then moving on to some of the modeling and remote sensing work to try to scale those really local impacts across the entire watershed. So for part one, when we're trying to understand the local trade-offs, we really capitalize on this emerald ash borer removal program from the city of St. Paul with the help of Rachel Coyle and the city of St. Paul, who has helped us kind of guide us on where we should cite our work. And so all these dots that you're seeing here are planned or ongoing removals and or treatments of infested emerald ash borer trees across the city. And these are co-located with the Capital Region Watershed District's monitoring program of their stormwater outlets on the same map. And so in choosing our sites, for sites, we've kind of had to balance a mix of where data is available, how are they co-located, how do we distribute them across different neighborhoods of different socioeconomic incomes, and just kind of thinking about how much also resources that we have to try to sample things in these in these sites. At each of our 4 parks, we have co-located a bunch of instruments that measure, for example, air temperature and relative humidity in the immediately under the canopy and outside of the canopy, as well as rain gauges underneath the canopy to kind of get a sense of throughfall when it's coupled with a rain gauge outside of the canopy. We have soil moisture sensors, throughfall collectors to test rainfall chemistry, as well as these homebrew sat flux sensors and data loggers that really had to be modified because we cannot have a gigantic data logger with like a 12-volt car battery hooked up with lots of wires running around all these parks, because people will just trip over them and do all sorts of things. So we're interested in fluxes. One, going up, water flux is going up from the ground into the air, because transpiration or water use by trees is linked to not just how stressed they are, but also how well they function in terms of cooling their environment. We're also interested in the water coming down from the tree canopies. And so these are the through-fall collectors that Diana's group have been collecting last year to test what kinds of nutrient constituents are in the through-fall, including nitrogen, ammonia, phosphorus, I think total organic carbon content as well. And then we've also gone out in the fall and earlier this spring during the melt season to collect some of the leaf litter that are strewn across, like under the canopy, on the streets, just to see what kinds of nutrients and total organic carbon are contained in those leaf fall. So here are some preliminary data that we've compiled from last season. So this is kind of a complicated plot. So these are 4 sites. And again, we have sensors that are co-located, one underneath the canopy and one in the open air. And what you're seeing on the y-axis here is the temperature reduction that are under the canopy. So the difference between open air and under canopy, with positive numbers showing a reduction in temperature that are directly under the canopy. And so you can kind of see, first of all, that there is some spatial heterogeneity, like variations in how much trees are able to reduce air temperature across the different parks. And also that it shows kind of this diurnal pattern where as you get hotter and hotter, so these are averaged over many, many days, right? So as you get into the hotter parts of the late afternoon, the trees are able to generally cool their environments much more. And when we couple this with the sat flux data showing us how much water trees are using, these kind of tend to generally follow the same patterns. And we're reinstalling these sensors again out in the same parks on the same trees this year to try to kind of achieve a little bit more robustness in our data. And so please talk to Shadi of the process that she took to kind of develop and install these sensors. One thing that, well, we know that last year we had a drought. One hypothesis that we're testing here too is that these cooling effects are not just, there all the time, right? Like sometimes their cooling benefits might be restricted by the fact that they don't have enough water in the ground to support that transpiration stream. Here are some data that Faith presented at her defense last week. So on the top, you'll see weekly precipitation totals. We also have data from the through-fall collectors. So the difference between those will give us the amount of storm water that can be potentially intercepted by the tree canopy. And then on the bottom, you'll see from July to November, the kind of averaged nitrate concentration that are contained in the through-fall. And so this follows sort of both a temporal pattern where you have more nitrate coming through the canopy toward the beginning of the season, but also this kind of coincided with a period of increasing rainfall amounts. So we're still trying to figure out how to interpret this in terms of variations and whether this is going to be explained by just seasonal variations in canopy cover, which we do have data for LAI, for leaf area index, or just because that this decrease is driven by a dilution effect from the increase in precipitation amounts. And so one hypothesis that we're testing for is to kind of think about the trade-offs between the ability of trees to reduce stormwater volumes, but increase concentrations of nutrients in their through-fall. 5 minutes, okay. So part 2, we're trying to scale these local effects to the watershed level, and we're taking kind of a 2-pronged approach. One, in the stormwater front, we have Indigo working with Shating to characterize the stormwater network structure across these kind of 11 different catchments, urban catchments throughout the metro. And doing some modeling work with that. The other, on the temperature front, we have Jeannie, who has used a satellite surface temperature map coupled with land cover data set with a downscaling procedure to produce canopy temperature maps across the Twin Cities, and then eventually using machine learning algorithms to extract a relationship between stress, species, urban environment. Please go talk to Jeannie about this, this work. So for the stormwater network structure project, we're varying the green infrastructure coverage, placement, and flow path of the structure itself, feeding it into a stormwater management model under a different set of rainfall scenarios to examine these hydrological outcomes, including peak flow at the outlet and the total flood volume within the structure, and finding results like, you know, that we have trade-offs between peak flow at the outlet and inland flooding, which points to the importance of identifying the desired hydrological outcomes that you want to manage for, and that this green infrastructure coverage and placement is effective only up to a point. So under extreme rainfall scenarios, the effect of the stormwater network structure still will dominate over where you place these green infrastructure, like these rain gardens. And these are pulled from Jeannie's map of the downscaled canopy temperature across the Twin Cities. This is different from surface temperature that are directly measured from satellite information, because within a grid of 70 by 70 meters, you don't always just have trees. You have trees with roads and buildings. And so Jeannie's work really kind of, this is kind of a new product that really only pinpoint to the temperature in the canopy, and then we can take the difference between canopy temperature and land surface temperature. And one cool thing that I think we found is that this temperature difference between canopy and land surface is actually much patchier than canopy or land surface temperature map themselves, which points to the effect of canopy as being much more localized than we expect, right? And so decisions about where you place trees is going to influence things much more at the local level. And this delta T, this temperature difference actually also has a distribution with a range around 10 degrees. Oh, I had the extra slides. Sorry, 10 degrees. And so this kind of motivates us to figure out where the best location could be for planting trees. And so that's the end of my slides. So I might have time for one question. One question. We could move on.
Sure. So our next speaker is Chip Small from the University of St. Thomas, and he's going to be talking about work on lakes.
Great, thank you. All right, so obviously we have a lot of lakes around the Twin Cities metro area, and they're important for us and for human nature interactions for a lot of reasons. They're part of our municipal drinking water treatment system. Obviously, lots of opportunities for recreation and aesthetics. And so there's a number of different factors that influence water quality, from physical factors such as watershed area, lake depth, to these sort of inadvertent human effects, things like road salt inputs and land use impervious surface in the watershed. And then there's active management, things like alum treatments in lakes, fisheries management. So it's really the interaction between all of these different variables. So we have basically a huge uncontrolled experiment in the 1,000 or so lakes around the Twin Cities metro area. So it's a lot to think about. So I'll briefly touch on some of the active research areas that our team's working on. So this data synthesis effort, pulling together all of this existing lake data and the kinds of inferences that we can make with that, and then also some connections to some of the other teams, including urban vegetation, perceptions of water quality change, kind of the social side of that, and then toxins and metals as well. So there's a lot of data for over 1,500 lakes in the 7-county metro area. We have some basic physical data, and then some high quality time series water quality data for over 300 lakes with records of 20 plus years of data. You can see on the left kind of a couple of decades of really consistent data, and some lakes have records that go back even before 1970. So that's been a huge effort that Katie Pollack and Grace Newmiller have put a lot of time into compiling and trying to make these comparable data sets. And so, some basic questions that you can ask with huge data sets like that. This is one example from some of the lakes where we have the longest term data sets. What are the trends in water quality? And so, in general, the lakes that have lowest levels of nutrients, lowest total phosphorus and nitrogen, aren't changing that much. The lakes that have high levels on average are getting a little bit cleaner, but not consistently. There's a lot of variation in there. And so one thing that we're interested in doing, and some of my students are going to be getting into this a little bit this summer, is using some lake models to generate hypotheses that then we can test against some of these larger data sets. And I'd be happy to talk to folks more about that and get some ideas. One example that we want to talk about a little bit is Katie Pollack's work with alum-treated lakes. So a lot of lakes around the Twin Cities, I don't know if you can see the lighter blue, but over 100 lakes in the Twin Cities metro area have been treated with alum aluminum sulfate, which binds to available phosphorus, and it tends to make the lake water clearer for 10 years or so. In fact, one of our partners lakes is being treated today or tomorrow, I think. So this is pretty common, 6 or more lakes every year. And so we know that chlorophyll decreases, total phosphorus decreases, but we're interested in kind of interactions between different nutrients and how might this affect, for example, nitrogen. And we've heard from a lake manager at the National Association of Lake Management Society conference. Alum doesn't impact nitrogen. We've proven it, but it probably does. If there's less phytoplankton biomass in the water, that's going to affect what's happening with nitrogen, and we do see the total nitrogen decreases, but not as much as the phosphorus, so it changes the nitrogen to phosphorus ratios. Although intriguingly, some of the larger lakes, you actually see a buildup of nitrate following alum treatment. So there's some interesting patterns there that I think we can explore more. And so Katie's done some really neat sediment core incubations, looking at denitrification rates. And so experimentally adding alum into the water cores here, and you get this layer of flock that builds up. And even though oxygen consumption stays consistent, the rate of denitrification drops a lot because there's less diffusion of nitrate across that barrier. So we'll learn more about that. And in fact, we're leveraging some of the ongoing alum treatments in some of the lakes in the area this summer to get kind of before and after data. So we'll learn a lot from that. Another kind of line of research here is some work that Grace is doing, and we can see more in her poster later today. But I'm looking at Woodbury in the eastern suburbs, where land use has changed quite a bit from the 1980s, which this area was agricultural, to today, which is highly developed suburbs. And so you can see from Shating's map here, the build out of the stormwater system to the east over the decades. A lot of this was kind of built out in the 1990s and 2000s. And so the total cumulative pipe density has increased. And so Grace has asked, well, how does that affect water quality in these lakes? You might expect, a simple relationship between urbanization and, degrading water quality, but it's really not that simple at all. And what we see is as after the build out, once pipe density has sort of leveled out, water quality in at least some of these lakes has increased, right? The total phosphorus levels have declined. So in fact, really for each lake, it's a complicated story of the whole history of stormwater best management practices, the metro-wide phosphorus band. So there's a whole series of events that are really affecting water quality in each individual lake. It's a complex story. Just connected to the stormwater system and best management practices, a lot of folks that kind of affiliated under the LTER umbrella are doing work on urban stormwater ponds as well. There's 15,000 or more of these stormwater ponds around the cities, and there's a lot that we don't know. Are they working as they're supposed to? Are they improving water quality? Can they be managed? And so work by John Gulliver and colleagues is collecting a bunch of data, comprehensive survey, intensive sampling, high frequency monitoring from some of these. So that's sort of a related component of the lake effort. And then a connection with the forest team. There's been lots of work by folks associated with the project here on the tree impacts on hydrology, as you just heard from Shui, tree impacts on water quality, Ben Jenke and colleagues, street sweeping, tree impacts on ponds, capture of core solids. So lots of related efforts there that ultimately are affecting water quality downstream in lakes. Briefly touch on another effort. We've done a lot of work at the Wakan TP site, which Emilie mentioned earlier this morning. And while Emilie's work focused on the terrestrial habitat there, I had a team of students from St. Thomas, and then some of the folks from Jacques' lab as well have made various measurements in the springs and streams and ponds at that site. This is a site that has a history of heavy metal contamination from industry over the past 150 years, but there's been extensive restoration efforts, and for the most part, heavy metals are not looking too bad, although we've seen elevated levels of arsenic in some cases, both in the stream sediment and also in the watercress, which some people actually harvest and consume. So that's something to be aware of. And then that was connected to a project that our RAU student, Parker Arnson Bowden, conducted last summer. She was interested in this invasive snail that's prevalent in a lot of lakes in the metro area, and whether there's any relationship between heavy metals in lake sediments and in the snail biomass. So interesting project, no strong relationships there, but we learned there's a lot of snails. Finally, I want to briefly touch on a project that we're doing with Bonnie Keeler, collecting data from community members who are visiting lakes. We piloted this last year on Como Lake. We're expanding to Lake Phalen this year and possibly additional lakes in the future, but we have signs up inviting folks to, there's a hook question, in this case asking, how many watercraft do you see on the lake right now? And you can text the answer to that, and then you get a series of follow-up survey questions, 14 of them. We had 242 people that responded to the survey. 130 of them answered all 14 questions. So a lot of our questions were specifically questions that our partners from St. Paul Parks wanted to know for the regional parks plan. So there's a lot of questions about transportation and do you feel safe in the parks? But we have a couple of water quality questions, and we're really interested in perceptions of water quality. And in some cases, there's a disconnect between what the data say about the metrics that we measure and how people feel about the water quality. And so it's going to be really interesting to compare that. So we have a question about, how do you characterize the water quality today? And then also, what's your perception of the trend in water quality over time? And so we can plot, this is kind of messy, but plot the actual Secchi depth, for example, which is the green dots there, versus the blue dots are people's perception of water quality that day, to get an idea of how they're perceiving it. And then water quality change over time. Most people considered it staying about the same or improving. And actually folks who have lived in the area longer had a stronger feeling that the lake water quality is improving, which corresponds to a lot of active management efforts, alum treatments and shoreline restoration, and a lot of work that the watershed district's done. This year is going to be interesting because the water is a lot clearer. The macrophytes, the pondweed is going crazy, and a lot of times people don't like that. So the chlorophyll level, some of the metrics may say the lake water is really clean, but we may see a decrease in people's perception. So those are some of the many related efforts that the Lakes team is working on, and I'll take questions if we have time. Yes.
You talked some about development in Woodbury and how water quality is changing in relation to it. Do you see patterns in terms of habitat management in relationship to development? Do you see like decline in wetland species, or now we're protecting wetlands? How's that impacted by development?
It's a great question. I'm going to defer to Grace.
Yeah, that's a great question. Something that we're still looking into, but we have seen that it just turned off. Sorry. In terms of shoreline development, it's interesting to look at patterns of canopy disturbances and how that has impacted water quality in these lakes since they've been really heavily suburbanized. And we have seen some continued improvements in water quality after those disturbances and construction kind of settled out. So, but yeah, that'd be interesting to look at the habitat patches.
Any other questions? I can defer to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Chip. All right. So we're gonna take one more 15-minute break. So come back at 11:15 again. If you haven't signed in, please do that. And there's still room. I think there's one tour that's only half full and one tour that's completely empty. So there is still room to do a tour. If you're interested, just go ahead and sign up. And then we'll meet back here in 15 minutes for the last 3 talks before lunch. All right, we're gonna have our last group of talks, which are more social science dominated. I don't know what the word is. Directed talks. But our first talk is going to be given by Kate Derrickson, who's from the Geography Department at the University of Minnesota.
Hello, everyone. Am I going to get kicked out because I have notes? I know you're not supposed to speak with notes. Okay, so I'm talking about question 3.1, which is a collaboration of all these folks here and co-led by me and Bonnie Keeler. And this work really started as through some seed money we got through the University of Minnesota for a project that we called the CREATE Initiative. And that project was aimed at working with environmental justice communities to ask what their research questions were with respect to environmental justice. And so to do that, we built on existing relationships that we had, and we developed some new ones here in the Twin Cities as well. And those folks identified investment without displacement as a core issue for them. So they were eager for green infrastructure and green investment and tools for climate adaptation, but they were really concerned that these investments would drive up property values and lead to displacement. And we'd seen evidence of that in Atlanta, where a lot of us had been doing some work for quite some time. So it was through this consultation process that we really began to link housing market dynamics like gentrification, displacement, and racialized exclusion with environmental planning and green infrastructure. And so, work in geography had linked this with respect to environmental disamenities, showing how people move away from undesirable land uses. But our collaborators really got us interested in the relationship between amenities, housing markets, and racialized exclusion. And so one of the things we did, which many of you will have seen before, is we put together this toolkit that we call Sharing in the Benefits of a Greening City. That was kind of the answer to the question of like, well, what can you do about that? Because we talked to a lot of different people who were like, I'm not really sure green gentrification is a thing, or I don't really know what we would do about it. And so we looked at what communities were doing about it, some of the policy tools they were using, some of the strategies for organizing that they were using, and we put it together in a toolkit. And you can find that online if you're interested, or there are some copies up front if you want to take some. We started doing this work around a time when the Mapping Prejudice Project, based here at the University of Minnesota, was developing this novel data set to map every racially restrictive covenant in Hennepin County. And many of you will be familiar with this project at this point, but just quick overview, racial covenants are language in property deeds that make legal restrictions on who can buy property on the basis of their race. And so we had long known that covenants were a thing. Racial covenants were a thing. We had long suspected that they had had a long range impact on housing market dynamics and geographies in Hennepin County and in cities across the United States. But when Mapping Prejudice mapped every racially restrictive covenant through this a massive undertaking and this amazing digital humanities project, we were really able to see how long their tail was. So we were able to see that, in fact, places where there were a lot of racially restrictive covenants were the places that remain in the contemporary geographies of the Twin Cities, places where that remain majority white. And we were able to see that places that didn't have covenants ended up being places where people of color in the Twin Cities were concentrated. And we saw that covenants overlapped with or were in concert with some of the other tools that governments and markets use to govern the housing market as well, like the redlining maps that you'll be familiar with. So we were, taking this, information allowed us to start to think about not just kind of the baseline conditions, which we know about the Twin Cities, which is that these neighborhoods where there are more people of color have more environmental disamenities, and that's the kind of provocation of environmental justice. Instead of taking that baseline perspective, we started to say, okay, these historical dynamics have long-reaching implications. So let's try to understand these outcomes and these things that we're taking as baselines as historically rooted and part of a longer-term process. And so we started, we realized all maps in Minneapolis basically look the same, where the good stuff is in one neighborhood, in certain neighborhoods, and the bad stuff is in other neighborhoods. And that was really consistent. But what these covenant maps helped us see was how the good stuff is close to covenants. And so this is a map that Rebecca Walker made, Dr. Rebecca Walker made. It's a newly minted PhD made, and that shows that the parks that people most want to go to in the Twin Cities are in close proximity, or in Minneapolis, are in close proximity to where there were the densest concentration of racially restrictive covenants. And so these kinds of findings led us to ask these big picture questions about what is the relationship between housing markets, environmental planning, and racial inequality in US cities. So we were especially interested in the racial wealth gap, which we know is fueled in large part by housing market dynamics. And we were really interested in this question of what are the mechanisms that create those correlations. So, a lot of people had been, ever since this historical data has been digitized, which has been kind of an explosion that's been really helpful, people have been noticing and noting the kind of overlays between all those things that I just talked about. The fact that the good stuff is in the neighborhoods that were designated green on homeowners loan corporation maps. The bad stuff is in neighborhoods that are redlined. And we were finding the same thing with covenants. So there's a big kind of burgeoning set of literature that gets at that. But we were really interested in the mechanistic understanding of what is actually driving these dynamics. So how does this actually work? Not taking this baseline of overlays, but looking at the historical processes that created it. So we've got these 3 research questions that we're working through. How have investments in the natural environment interacted with social, economic, and built infrastructure to shape the distribution of wealth? How much of investments in the natural environment shaped the racial wealth gap in cities? And what are the opportunities to disrupt these tendencies and patterns? And we're using qualitative methods, using archival data, document review, and interviews. We're using quantitative spatial data overlays, statistical modeling, and we're working at a time span from the 1850s to today and looking largely at Hennepin and Ramsey County. So we've got like everyone who's gone before, a number of different research projects that are trying to answer these questions, some of which are going to be on a poster this afternoon, some of which are going to be in field talks later on this afternoon. And so there's not a lot of time to go into great detail about all of them, but I'll do a quick overview depending on where I end up with time. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is one that maybe some of you have heard about. It's in a paper that just came out in the American Association of Geographers. And this looks at the way this question of how did this happen? What are the historical dynamics that created these outcomes? And building on some work that Hannah Raymer had done in her dissertation, we were able to take a deep dive into two developments in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis along the chain of lakes, and to really get a sense of how closely developers worked with the park board and with real estate kind of movers and shakers throughout the city to both kind of create desirable nature, like the chain of lakes that we all know and love now, while also using racially restrictive covenants as a tool to make sure that those areas were for whites only. And so that tight coupling between desirable nature that our city is kind of known for and racialized exclusion is really kind of fundamental to the creation of the nature that we're trying to manage today in the cities. A second project that we've been working on uses the Homeowners Loan Corporation descriptions. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation is a federal agency that was designed to do a variety of different things to kind of shore up government investments in different mortgages and things like that. But part of what they did in order to do that was go neighborhood by neighborhood in a variety of American cities and identify and just categorize each neighborhood using a variety of different narrative descriptions. And that's what ultimately became what we know as the redlining maps. And so lots and lots of people have taken a look at what's in those descriptions in terms of race and the racial characteristics of the neighborhood. But what our team has done is take a look at how nature is discussed in 9 cities in the Midwest in those area descriptions. And so what they found is that there are a variety of different ways that nature is talked about, and it's not consistent. So they use grades of A, B, C, and D, and A and B are the kind of good grades, and C and D are the less good grades. And what they mean by that is less, like more risky investments, more risky mortgages, potentially changing neighborhoods. And what the team found when they did all this coding of these area descriptions is that nature is talked about quite a bit. And that the characteristics of the neighborhood, the demographics of the neighborhood really influence how that nature is perceived. So in some places, being hilly is, seen as an asset. It's a kind of bucolic neighborhood. In some places, the topography, being hilly is a detriment. And so the findings really show that a couple of things. One, people's perceptions of nature at the time were really being shaped in large part by their broader perceptions of the characteristics of the neighborhood. Another finding is that these kind of geographies of environmental injustice were in place as early as the 1930s and 40s. So these patterns that we're seeing today in terms of like I said, the good stuff being in some neighborhoods and the bad stuff being in other neighborhoods, and that being really shaped by the racial characteristics of the neighborhood is a relationship, an urban dynamic that goes back at least as long as these maps. Okay, so a few other projects to work through. I'm going to skip this one. Well, I'll just say that we're looking at long-term data on investments in the Minneapolis parks. It's been a beast to disentangle budgets and put them into categories, but the team has been working on trying to figure out that. And this is a really cool project that there's I won't go into a lot of detail about because there's a poster that goes into detail about it that you can see in the poster session later. But we're trying to use Zillow data here to understand how green amenities or parks in particular are changing property values. And it's hard to get Zillow data and we only have it for a short amount of time. So that's been a cool project that's been led by a PhD student. And the last project that will be a topic of a field talk later today by Rebecca and Hannah is looking at this question of how do community understandings of green gentrification articulate with broader processes. And so we were especially interested in this phrase, just green enough, which is a phrase that gets at the anxieties that communities feel around green infrastructure investments and the ways that they organize accordingly. Social scientists have found that communities will kind of advocate against big, beautiful, amazing projects that most people would want because they're concerned that it'll drive up their property values or drive up their rents and displace them from neighborhoods. And so people had observed that this strategy of advocating for things that are just green enough was something that was happening in vulnerable neighborhoods. And then that term started kind of working its way in planning literature till it winds up in a Minneapolis Park Board planning document saying, oh, how we're going to plan the Upper Harbor Terminal is that it's just green enough. And so we started asking some questions about, okay, what is that concept doing? What's happening when we use it? Is this kind of, what work is it doing in the world? And so Hannah and Rebecca will talk more about that at the Upper Harbor Terminal. So quick overview of all the projects that we have, and I have 1 minute for questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Kate. Our next presentation, I'm looking around for Megan. There you are. Is going to be given by Megan Classic, who is a postdoc working with Kristen Nelson and Forrest Fleischman. And she's going to be talking about the governance project.
All right. Everybody hear me? Yeah. So I'm going to be talking about our work around advocacy, policy, and practice, or Q 3.2 for those tracking the numbers. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to our research team. I'll focus then primarily on some of our current projects and then wrap up with some opportunities for you all to be involved. So this is our core research team on the right. Our fearless leaders are Kristen Nelson and Forrest Fleischman. But this work would be impossible without a large number of undergrad and graduate interns that we've had working with us over the past year and a half. So just to come back to the conceptual framework real quick, we are working across both urban nature and social layers that Sarah spent a little bit of time talking about this morning, so I won't belabor that. But we're particularly interested in understanding the dynamics of the benefits and burdens of urban nature. And so Kate did a really good job of sort of teeing this up. But just to give an example, what we mean by burdens, where we find higher concentrations of communities of color, we find higher overall average temperatures, fewer parkland acres, and a lower percentage of tree canopy. And so this really drives our team's question, which is focused on how can we change these decision-making processes to address that equity challenge. Our hope is then to get to better or improved environmental and social well-being for all urban residents. And so to do this, we first need to understand how decisions are made, who's involved, and how they relate to one another. So we can think about along the top of this diagram, the different levels of government that somehow have rules or practices that shape how urban nature is managed. And then of course, we can think about other groups. So NGOs, nonprofits, businesses, and then residents that also make decisions. So for example, if there's a big storm in the city and a tree limb falls down on your property and your neighbors, when you have a discussion with them about whose responsibility it is, how you're going to deal with it, and what you're going to deal with the branches afterwards, that's contributing to urban nature decision-making. So all of these connections, the takeaway of this is that it's complex. And so our work really aims at trying to understand these dynamics. And so we're really interested in diverse perspectives, largely coming from place-based knowledge. So people that live here know about nature. They have perspectives of nature. They define nature in different ways. And all of this understanding can help us improve our understanding of both the social ecological system as a whole, but also how to improve urban nature management. So I'm going to touch on a couple of our projects. So we're looking at a number of text data. So this looks at the relationship between municipal government and residents. So here we took a subset of 31 municipalities across the metro region. And we have a paper that's under review right now that zooms into 5 of these municipalities. And they represent here a range of population sizes, median household incomes, and percentage BIPOC or Black, Indigenous people of color. And so in that, we're really asking, how do these municipal governments allow for the public to be involved in making decisions about urban nature? And so you can see some of the different types of nature that we're looking at. One of the big findings of this work is that, yes, there are a lot of different mechanisms. So there's 10 different ways to do written or oral comment. And again, this is just across 5 municipalities. But overwhelmingly, public hearings are the primary mechanism that's used for public engagement. And so if you don't know anything about public hearings, they're typically more strict in structure. So people often have to pre-register in order to speak. They often need to submit their evidence or the information or talking points that they're going to share ahead of time. And then during the actual hearings themselves, there's little opportunity for discussion or rebuttal of points that are brought up by different people. So what we try to argue is that if the goal of these municipalities is really to reflect what the public wants and to involve them substantively in how decisions are made and in how nature is distributed, they need to really reflect on the engagement mechanisms that they're using to see if they're the correct ones. So in addition to this work, we also have pulled comprehensive plans or general plans and climate plans. We also have a number of newspaper articles where we're looking at, again, engagement in nature management, but also looking at what municipalities' goals are and priorities, what their enforcement processes are when people break local rules or local ordinances, and then in a broader term, how urban nature is being thought about in terms of climate change and climate change planning. Our next section looks at a number of case studies and interviews that involves relationships between municipal and county government, as well as NGOs and residents. And so here we take a subset of 6 of the municipalities across the MSP region. And we're asking questions like, what are municipalities' priorities? What do they care about? As well as how are they thinking about climate change? We look at a number of other questions too, but I'm just going to focus on these 2 today. So just to give a snapshot of this across 3 communities, we find a range of priorities. So for example, in Brooklyn Park, there was a lot of discussion about the tension between the need or want for economic development with the want to preserve green and open space. In Woodbury, as a comparison, PFAS was a really big theme, so emergent contaminants, and there's a really big lawsuit going on there. When we look at climate change, we see a similar variation in how municipalities are focusing on climate change. So in Anoka, there's very little discussion of climate change, for example, but in Woodbury, there are some strategic plans, but again, the PFAS issue is really pulling attention. So we're continuing to do a number of other case studies, and we've been presenting the preliminary work, our preliminary findings in a series of focus groups back in the communities to garner additional support and input. And then we have a number of resident surveys. So here we're focusing primarily on residents, as well as a little bit of their relationship with the municipal government. So we're asking a range of questions around lawn management and preferences and values, around pollinator opinions, and then around advocacy or promoting or engaging with trying to expand where things like bee lawns are being adopted. So a lot of this work is collaborative across other teams for the LTER. So just to show a couple pieces that build on what Susanna presented earlier. So we asked about how folks advocate. And so we found that the overwhelming way is by word of mouth, which is that really tall bar on the end. That compares to social media, and then also at this smallest end, writing a newspaper article or an op-ed. So people tend to be using these more informal approaches, so to speak, of promoting or engaging with their community. So then we asked how they participate in groups to advocate. And here, the 2 bars on the left are both participating in interest groups or club groups, and then block parties or dinner parties. All the way at the end, the purple is attending or participating in city council meetings. So very few people are attending or participating in those council meetings. In fact, when we zoom into that, and I apologize, this is cut off. Overwhelmingly, the folks that are doing this are just observing. So they're not actually substantively engaging in the city council process. So again, with this work, we can start to tie it back to some of the findings from the ordinance work to start picking up new hypotheses about, okay, well, is it the engagement mechanisms that are being employed that are really preventing or serving as a barrier to people being more engaged in the work that's being done? We also asked a couple questions about pollinator beliefs. So here we're looking at the proportion, what proportion of bees sting. On the red bar, I don't know if you can see it, but any guesses what it says? Maybe for the folks in the back that can't see it. It says few bees sting. So, and then we asked, how concerned are you about being stung? So not at all, or very little concern. So when we add this to some of what Susanna was talking about earlier, we can start to think of broader questions of what are the barriers to bee lawn adoption. Maybe it's not the bees or perceptions of the bees. Maybe it's something else like access, affordability, these other themes. And so by doing these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary projects, we can start to tease out some of these themes. And then we have a survey that's just getting launched now at the Bell Museum. Thanks. Guess I'm talking too fast. So here we have 3 different types of lawn management. So it's a bee lawn, a conventional or typical Kentucky bluegrass, and then a fine fescue, which is a lower water fertilizer input, at least from my limited understanding of physical science. So you have to ask the lawn people. And so here you can see this just shows you 4 phases. We planted it last winter, I guess, and it's been growing since. And so we just put out a number of these signs. So folks visiting the Bell Museum can use the QR code, or there's a shortened URL, and they can take a survey. So this will be one of the field trip stops tomorrow, and my colleague Audrey will be talking about it. And she'll be talking about some of the challenges and benefits of these multidisciplinary projects, because we did run into some barriers, such as the social scientists being gung-ho about developing the survey and not realizing that it would take several months for these lawns to be established. And so when we wanted to ask questions comparing the plots, it wasn't necessary. But the perk of that is that we were able to sort of step back, and now we're rolling out the survey in 2 phases. So the first phase that's out there now asks people more abstractly about their preferences of bee lawns. We provide some information about establishment, so we can start to understand how people interact with the establishment of different lawns. And then there are a couple broader activities that we're working on. So these touch on the entire network. So we're working with Sally and folks on the forest team to look at advocacy of folks that are involved in urban forest and tree management. We are also working with folks across the LTER to hopefully launch a podcast that will elevate both community member perspectives as well as researcher perspectives. And this is work with folks like Mary and Meredith. 2 of the priority topics that have sort of come up in our discussions are around emerald ash borer and then recreation and water uses. And then our team is all, I think we're all on the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice team for the LTER. And so we helped pull together the EJ seminar series that was offered this year, and we're hoping to do that again next year. So then just to wrap up, some opportunities to be involved. One is definitely the podcast. We love perspectives and we love diverse perspectives. So if you want to talk to us about anything, please let me know. If you want to complain about your municipal ordinances, I will listen to you. If you want to talk about how your neighbor mows too frequently, I feel your pain and I will talk to you about it. We're, again, really interested in understanding these whole system dynamics of how nature is managed. And of course, if you have ideas for topics for the podcast, please talk to us as well. So with that, thank you, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
All right. Thanks, Megan. I'm curious how, when you were doing the surveys and talking to folks, how you accounted for COVID effects on civic engagement. And if I could imagine it could go multiple ways, right? Lots of meetings went online. So it was potentially easier access for people to connect in those ways. But in other places, I could see it could also make it harder. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering how you accounted for that in your work, or if you're tracking that.
That is a great question. So most of the case study interviews are being led by Audrey Robeson, who I think is online, and she'll be doing the field talk tomorrow, so you can definitely connect with her there. But we definitely saw the dynamics that you talked about, right? So on the one side, we were able to still do interviews virtually, and I think most of the first case study Audrey did was virtual over Zoom. But what we're seeing now is that some municipalities are actually getting rid of in-person altogether. And so they're claiming it as this allows everyone to access it and it's like more efficient. But in reality, right, we know that face-to-face is much better, and there's a lot of benefits to that. So I'm guessing that we'll see challenges with that, particularly as we track this over time. But yeah, it's a great question.
Okay, our last speaker of the morning is Rebecca Montgomery, who's from the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota.
Great, thank you so much. I first need to acknowledge the rest of the team here. I think, Mike, you're the only one here today, Mike back there, but May Davenport, Chennai Matson, and Sashi White participated in this. And actually, Shania, I want to give a shout out to Shania, who we were supposed to be tag teaming this talk today. And Shania wasn't able to be here. And Shania made all the slides that I am going to be speaking from. So, and put this presentation together. So I hope I can do her work justice today. So I'm going to talk about the community engaged research team work, kind of updates and some ideas that might spark discussion later. What does our research team do? And I'm going to read, there's a lot of text on some of these slides. I'm going to read it for accessibility reasons. Our team is comprised of social science and ecology researchers, public artists, cultural organizers, and community partners. We research and practice community engaged science to deepen relationships, develop new research questions and methods, and increase the benefits of natural science research to local communities. And I think obviously there's people beyond our particular team doing this work. I think this is kind of speaking for all of us within this LTER that are doing this type of work. And we're really thinking about moving from transactional ways of relating to partners, so exchanging maybe data, for example, to more reciprocal relationships rooted in mutual respect and shared goals. So that kind of questions emerging from the community that we've seen in some of the other presentations here today. Early in the LTER, as a group, we developed some core principles for that community engaged research. And I think at the last All Scientists meeting, May talked about kind of how all of the researchers felt about their ability to engage with some of these principles. So this idea of seeking mutual respect, honoring land sovereignty and indigenous rights, actively listening to different ways of knowing and engaging, valuing community and cultural knowledge, continually prioritizing relationship building, identifying project outcomes that benefit community partners, and encouraging this robust exchange of ideas. Some of the activities this year, one of the things that happened this year was a bit of a shift in focus in that we had come in and we ourselves had goals, right? As community science practitioners, and we sort of shifted and we're working to shift towards an approach that responds to and emerges from that engagement with community. We continue to meet regularly as a team and with our core community partners. And as relationships and collaborations emerge, we support those by connecting our partners with research, organizing, data, other informational resources, and advocacy. We conduct an annual survey of LTER program personnel, and then also are following and tracking community engaged science practices across the LTER program to learn about promising initiatives, new relationships that the team can support, and partnerships that we can encourage. So I'm going to present a little, just a peek into the most recent survey of the LTR personnel around their community engagement activities and approaches. And so this is in response to the question of what types of community partners have you engaged in your LTOR work over the last 12 months? And it's organized kind of by these government organizations moving down towards community residents. So some from kind of the more formally organized to just residents themselves. And I just want to highlight a couple of things, and that is there are these two big bars that's jump out: local government and community-based nonprofits as kind of our largest organizations that we're connecting with. And then there's also the community residents and state government are also quite large. And then when we move down to the ones that we have very little, less connections to, there are things like businesses and firms, tribal governments, faith-based organizations. So these are places that we don't have relationships and might represent some opportunities for expansion, or to think about, like, why are we engaged with this set of people and less so much with this set of groups? And then the next little piece that I want to pull out of the survey is how people are engaging. So this is sort of moving from, this is just a number of different ways so that we're engaged. And the other thing that I want to point out here is that the top one here is a sharing of local knowledge. I can't read on this thing here. And data sets or reports. So sharing what we're learning out is our number one thing. We also have pretty tall bars in this thing, in this part that really looks at working together to think about what those questions are, right? Which I think is a really good thing, right? We want to be working together to come up with what we're asking and reviewing some of those results. And so those are pretty high bars here. Where we maybe have room for growth is actually thinking about these things that we aren't doing so much data analysis together with those community partners. Often we might engage at the start or at the end, but maybe not through that whole process. And so this is maybe an area of growth, collaborating on data analysis, collaborating on writing those reports, collaborating on those publications. Those are the ways that we're not engaging so much and might, again, be areas for opportunity. So for the rest of this talk, Shen and I we all wanted to kind of bring in some of the community voices and as an example of one of the areas that we were working with today. And in advance of this, I just want to thank the community members and LTR researchers who shared their thoughts. And I'm going to be reading kind of quotes from a variety of people that respond to this. And I want to start with a project that arose out of relationships with an organization called Yo Mama's House, run by Amake Kubat, who is a resident of North Minneapolis and brought to our attention concerns that had emerged in North Minneapolis around ash tree removals. And there was a lot of tension, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of feeling of not knowing what's going on, why this is happening, a lot of feeling of, Amanke talked about, like, I just bought a house and now I'm being, charged a whole bunch of money to take this tree out. And like, nobody told me that the tree had to go when I bought the house, and felt like, I'm finally, getting into that wealth category, and now I'm like being penalized in some ways for this, and I didn't have the information. And there seemed to be like there's just a lot going on. And one of the things that Amaki wanted to do, she's really interested in kind of community healing, and so she wanted to host something called a repair cafe. And often these repair cafes are like coming together and sharing tools to actually fix physical things. She said, well, can we do something that brings people together and shares their experiences, shares information that can serve to heal from this trauma that the North Minneapolis has faced around ash removals. And so we had this event, and I think it was very successful. We brought in samples of EAB. We did some art making together. Anyone here, I know there's a few people, can people raise their hands if they went to the repair cafe? Okay, so it's not, yeah, and I went too. So there's 3 of us that are here that went to the repair cafe. So I want to share some perspectives from this whole, that whole experience in the form of quotes from some of the community members. And I want to thank Mitchell, who's here, for letting us share some of his perspectives and share his words with the group here. Mitchell wrote, I'm very grateful to have Mary Merrick-Spartz involved with our environmental justice work on the emerald ash borer infestation, specifically regarding forced tree removals and the spread of EAB. Meeting with an entomologist and a GIS expert was exactly what I needed to clear up some questions. Talking to Mary gave me a new perspective on the issue. And now Mary. I was surprised to find very detailed notes on interactions between Minneapolis residents and Minneapolis Park and Rec Board in the public ash tree data. So Mary got some of the data from that. Trees that were in public boulevard, but that individuals had an attachment to. MPRB, the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board, documented a lot of these conversations about why people valued the ash trees going back to 2014, such as the shade it provided or the sentimental value of a family member having planted the tree. The notes column contained a lot of useful local information about the ash tree canopy and treatment intentions of residents and requests for deferment or renewal. However, the notes column for public ash trees in North Minneapolis neighborhoods were mostly NA. They were missing from the conversation. And some of that missingness came out as frustration. Again, Mitchell, members of the public, especially organizers and activists, do not get the necessary information we need to prove what we already know to be true, nor do we always have the time to deep dive into the data. When the burden of proof is so heavy on those trying to prove targeted racism and injustice, it's great to have people in your court that come prepared with data, science, and expertise to back you up. So this was kind of talking about the impact of the LTR folks coming in and bringing information to the community through this repair cafe, and the importance that that played in helping in that process of understanding. And then the last quote from the repair cafe comes from Amake, who really was the force behind having this happen, the person who kind of envisioned what this would be. This was her sense after the event. Everyone came with expertise and a longing for connectivity. That's what allows people to imagine and grow. There was academic conversation, art making, indigenous and Afrocentric ways of knowing, and we were able on this one issue to say, what happened here? How can we work together to dismantle injustice and make deeper connections? And now we are talking about ways to interrupt this process of abrupt tree removals and ways to repair. And actually there was recently a message came out that there's a slowdown of all of the tree condemnation happening, pending getting more information out to people on their options, on financial support and things like that. So I think everyone who participated in this felt like this was a really important event and was really helpful in terms of coming together and kind of taking those next steps. So am I out of time? Okay, I have 1 minute. I have 1 minute because this isn't all that's happening out there. There's other really great work, and I just have 2 more little quotes to highlight those. And you've heard a little bit about this before, but I don't know about you, I love hearing people's voices about the kind of their experiences. So this is Emilie. Thank you, Emilie. In work with Walk on Teepee, which we heard about earlier today on the toxins, I've really enjoyed seeing a whole new human and historical dimension in our work, while also collecting information that can be of value to local communities. I've also found it challenging to build bridges and trust, given that organization representatives on both sides of the partnership are often in transient roles, right? We're moving, new people come in, new people leave. How do we maintain those relationships and that institutional knowledge with that type of turnover? I've loved learning what community partners are interested in, how that overlaps with our interests and goals, and building these mini questions within their site that allows both of us to learn new and interesting things. And then Lindsay, who has been working in urban gardens, talked about our research has been focused on heavy metal pollution, where people are directly impacted by the results of this work, such as community gardens. We found it important to have funds to support soil remediation if we find high levels of pollutants. We've been able to obtain funding through multiple grant agencies for this remediation, including a recent grant where we will be piloting a research mentorship partner with a community partner, and this is the Urban Roots, I believe, that Emilie talked about. So just to close up and talk about promising dimensions, I think by identifying interests, one of the things that we've been doing is really thinking about what are interest, commitments, capacities. Amake asked us a good question. Why are you invested in this? What is your intent coming in to do this work? And by being explicit and actually self-reflecting on that, that's really important in terms of that trust building. We think that growing some of these partnerships across disciplines with artists, culture bearers, organizations, and advocates is an area of fruitful direction to kind of deepen the engagement, creating opportunities for connections to form between us, including different site gatherings and opportunities for people to volunteer and like be in community and start talking to each other. And then one of the things that's come up a lot is thinking about how can we as an LTR support emergent community questions like we did in that ASH, in the ASH example, through time, data, maps, grant opportunities, perhaps a community resource hub. And with that, I will let everyone go to lunch. What? Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah and let everyone go to lunch. And thank you all for being patient with me.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you all for joining us this morning. So just to give you a sense of what's happening next, I think I saw pizza being rolled in. So lunch is happening. You can get your lunch in just down the hall in 305. And then you're welcome to take it wherever you want to eat. So unfortunately, I think the park is still fenced off, so we can't go up there. But if you go outside, there's some tables. You can also go down behind SAFL and take your lunch down there. You can kind of head up that way too. So I have some sunscreen. So if anybody ever needs sunscreen, I'm happy to share. Also pay attention to your tour if time and leader if you signed up. So just so that people know who they're looking for. The first tour, group 1, starts at 12:50. Andy Erickson, can you wave your hand? There's Andy. The second group starts at 1:10. Jacques, do you want to I see we have a little rivalry among the tour groups. Group 3 is at 1:20. That'll be led by Shui, who you already met. Group 4, 1:30. Jessica is back in the corner. I don't know if we got to group 5, but if it is, Andy again. So, be responsible for like paying attention to the time and finding your tour group leader. Oh, where? In here? Okay, in the auditorium. Thank you. And then the poster session starts at 1 o'clock, and the posters are basically distributed around the hallways. So you can just kind of go to those as it works for your time. And so that'll be ending around 2:30. And that's when the kind of more broad program concludes. And then the MSP LTER folks, we're going to make our way up to MWMO. And that'll be like at around 2:45, we'll start to head up that way. I just want to acknowledge some folks that made this all happen. So I have some people to thank. First of all, I really want to thank SAFL for letting us hold this event here. So Lian, I thank you. And then Jessica, I know, played a big role. Andy, Shui, Jacques, Ben, where's Ben? Ben has done a huge amount of work. Thanks to our like dynamic duo in the back, Ahmed and Sebastian, for their help. And Ben Erickson, I'm sure, is around working, so he's not in here, but huge thanks to him. And then thanks to folks who showed up this morning to help out. Jeannie was here and Luis was here. And Shating has been helping and also doing our timekeeping. Grace was here. Mary Merrick Sparts, unfortunately, is ill and she can't be here in person, but she's been helping behind the scenes. And then super grateful to the MWMO folks who are going to be hosting us this afternoon. So Uday and Dan. And then I don't know if we can get her in here. Can you go grab Meredith? See if she'll. Yeah, you want to go grab her? Okay, we'll see if you can get her. So the person who's really put this all together is Meredith Keller, and we'll see if she comes in here and we can say thank you. Big round of applause. Woo! Yeah. So thank you so much to Meredith, who has been doing just an enormous amount of organizational work behind the scenes to make all of this happen and to make sure that you're fed and had a place to park and et cetera, et cetera. So thank you, Meredith. Okay, so without further ado, I won't stand between you and your lunch. But thank you again all for coming.